Welcome back, metas. This is my ultimate Jaws guide where I look at mathematically what are the best mods to equip if you're running Jaws, and not just weapon mods but also every armor mod and also the combination of armor sets you should be using to maximize your damage. The idea for these videos to look at the math behind it came from seeing a lot of YouTube videos where one YouTuber uses one combination, another YouTuber uses another combination, and then you're sitting there going, well, which is better? And there's good reason you see one YouTuber say this is the best and another one says this is the best. And that's because a lot of mods, when you look at the math behind it, like sometimes there's only 1 to 5% difference between like this mod and another mod. And so when that's the case, and once you know which two mods are really close together, this is when prioritizing your primary attribute and your secondary attributes become really important. So that's my main goal for this, is to focus your attention to which mods damage-wise are very close, so you can have a look at your inventory and say, actually, I've got this mod. Its core effect might be like 5% less, but it's a violent mod and it's got crit damage and it's got weapon damage and it's got damage against great ones or elites for whatever you want to do. So you should be able to get a damage bump straight away just by understanding some of the math behind it and make a build that's right for you. If you haven't seen my previous videos, I basically plug all these stats into an Excel spreadsheet. I've got my formulas written out, which I'll tell you about as well. And I just work out mathematically which mod is better. I am human. I've spent like three weeks doing this in between streams. I've really tried to not make any mistakes, but there could be. And if you spot a mistake, let me know. Let me down gently, give me a little bit of constructive feedback, and I'll try to do better next time. As usual, I'll pin a comment with all the chapters in it. So if you want to skip the math and skip the explanation and just go straight to the results, just look at the chapters for each summary. And the reason I can spend weeks making these damage spreadsheets to try to give you the most accurate information as possible is because I do have a sponsor for this video. I'd appreciate if you listen to it. But before starting, this video is sponsored by Raycon. Raycon's everyday earbuds make every day that little bit easier. Like recently, we took a little holiday, which was about a 3-hour drive. And with my Raycon earbuds, my wife and I, we had one earbud each and could listen to the same podcast while the kiddo slept. The active noise cancellation is great for traveling, whether by car or plane. It blocks out that constant drone, allowing you to enjoy whatever you're listening to. And there is plenty of battery to make it through any trip with 32 hours of battery life. Raycon recently added a multi-point connectivity feature, allowing 2 devices to be connected at once, which is awesome if you share with someone else. I now no longer have to find my wife's phone to disconnect my Raycons from them so I can use them. Both phones can just stay connected. With a range of vibrant colors to suit everyone and the unique protective cases, you'll be able to find something that you love. And Raycon is so confident in that you have a 30-day happiness guarantee and can return them. So go to buyraycon.com/Myelin today to get 20 to 50% off site-wide. That's right, you can get up to 50% off everything on Raycon's website when you go to buyraycon.com/Myelin. Okay, first things first, let's look at how Jaws actually functions because this is the basis for the entire build. It says unstable bomber is triggered every 4 shots. Critical hits count as 1 shot for the above purpose. What that actually means is critical hits counts as 2 shots. It's kind of worded a bit weird, but it means 4 normal body shots, non-crit shots will cause an explosion, or 2 critical hits actually counts as 4 and you'll get an explosion. So the quickest you could get unstable bomber proccing is to crit twice and it will proc. Now, it does say every 4 shots, so it doesn't have to be on the same target. So you can do this. Okay, that's a non-crit. That's a crit. Explosion. Okay, so that crit counted as 2. That counted as 1 because it was non-crit. That counted as 1 because it was non-crit. That's your 4 hits, cause an explosion. So if you get 2 crits back to back, you'll cause an explosion. Anyway, 2 hits. 2 hits, 2 hits. So you really are aiming to have a high crit rate. So every bullet crits and you get an unstable bomber explosion. Now just quick note for damage testing here. I do just have copper bullets in. I'm in Eternal Land, so there's no cradle buffs active. I'm not doing all the other, not activating deviations and doing big hammer swings. So if you're wondering why damage is looking low, that is why. Cool. So how is the explosions actually calculated for unstable bomber? Here it says it counts as blast elemental damage. We're going to go over how all this stuff stacks in a second. But the explosion itself, it takes one status damage blast of 100% PSI intensity over 0.1 seconds. The blast rate is 1.5. The damage decays over the explosion distance down to a minimum of 50%. What that means is if I'm getting unstable bomber proccing here, there's an explosion, and you'll see there'll be damage taken to the other dummies. That damage is decaying, so the highest explosion damage will be on the center dummy, and then it decays to the other ones as well. How do you determine your PSI? Your PSI is this number here. Now, for a Jaws build, you actually have to, it's quite an end game build because you have to have everything leveled up. Your PSI, you have a base PSI stat. So if you actually unequip everything, you'll see you have a PSI stat. And this actually increases with your character level. So I have a base PSI stat of 125. It is very, very minimal increase with your character level, but it does go up a little bit. The main primary source of your PSI is going to be from your armor. And so you want to build tier 5 armor and also calibrate that armor to the max level. If you have other tiers like stars, your blueprint stars, that will also help. This will bump up your PSI intensity. So you do want all your gear calibrated, max at like tier 5 for everything to get the most PSI intensity. The other thing that also increases PSI is your bullets. You actually have a look at your bullets. You'll see that copper's like your base damage, which is why I use it. But as you move up, you'll see like steel has damage per shot plus 5%, but you also get plus 5% on your PSI intensity. Steel then has plus 8. Tungsten plus 10. Tungsten AP plus 15%. And then you have some other ones in here, which we'll talk about a bit later on. Okay, so what else does Jaws do? It says after hitting a weak spot, gain explosion elemental damage plus 30% for 8 seconds. So when you hit a weak spot like this, and then you get an explosion, you'll see that this explosion damage, so 5,300 there, will be higher, right? I'm going to talk about these numbers changing a little bit as well. If you're just doing, this lasts for 8 seconds, I've got to wait for this to cool off. If I didn't hit a weak spot, your status damage will be less, or your explosion damage will be less. So if you're just like shooting the body, right, we have less explosion damage from unstable bomber. So it does reward you hitting weak spots. It rewards a high crit rate so that every second bullet will cause an explosion. And it does also reward hitting a weak spot because you get plus 30% elemental blast damage, which is pretty hard in some scenarios. So we'll talk about that too. You definitely probably don't want to be sitting like this. And what was the last? Oh yeah, this is really, really important. This is very key to Jaws, is that unstable bomber can crit and has a crit rate plus 25%. Now at first I thought that the crit rate was actually just a reference to like unstable bomber had its own crit rate. And you can see it down here, unstable bomber crit rate bonus 25%. So I just thought it would crit 25% of the time, because normally unstable bomber cannot crit. I'll show you what it looks like when it doesn't crit. So when it's yellow, that's a crit. Let's see if we can get a non-crit. Okay, so that's a normal explosion there. No, there. Right, just the blue is a normal explosion. So a yellow or an orange unstable bomber is it critting, and the other one is just like a normal unstable bomber explosion. Now, as you see, it's obviously not capped at 25%. There is something else going on. It's very hard to actually work out what it's doing. I assume it's being added to your overall crit rate. I think the main take-home point for unstable bomber is if you get a high crit rate and you're critting on every shot, unstable bomber is also going to crit. So when I equip all of this stuff, let's just reload. And I crit. My unstable bomber here, you can see, is critting every single time. So this is really important because what it means is if you build into crit rates, it means every second shot's going to cause an explosion. And then if you build into crit damage, you are buffing each one of these bullets that are critting. You're also buffing your unstable bomber explosions with crit damage. This also scales with crit damage, which is why this build prioritizes crit rate and crit damage. You're getting a buff on your bullets, you're getting a buff on your explosions. Cool. Okay, let's talk about damage calculations. I think this is probably one of the most important parts of the video because if you can understand this, you can make much better decisions on which mods you select. That being said, it's probably the most boring part of the video as well, so see if you can get through it. Now, I have covered a lot of this in the past, so I will go quickly on some of the standard stuff, and then we really need to get to status and elemental damage and how they work, what are they, and how they stack together. Okay, so the very basics for calculating damage. Here I have the Jaws, its damage is 1053, however our damage stat is 895. That's because I have a calibration on here that has attack minus 15%. So that 15%'s been taken off the 1053, and that's my new damage here at 895. So the way we calculate a non-critical hit on the dummy, the damage formula is this, and I have improved this since some of the last videos. So a standard hit or a non-crit hit is our damage stat times our weapon damage times our enemy type damage times our debuff bonus times our mannequin modifier. So let's just go and add some of these values in here. Open up your stats page, make sure your gun is equipped and you haven't holstered it, otherwise your stats will change. So our weapon damage, have a quick look. Our weapon damage is 4.8%. So we're going to take the 895. We're going to times it by 1.048 for the 4.8%. We then need to look at our enemy type damage. Now the dummy, the mannequin counts as a common enemy or a normal enemy type. It's common in the stats. So I've got 2% of damage on there. So I'm going to times it by 1.02. And then I got to add in the debuff bonus. And what this is something like using the crossbow, which is applying bullseye. And if you have a look at bullseye gives you vulnerability plus 8%. And this basically just means you get 8% extra damage. So that's what I'm talking about with the debuff bonus. So if I shoot the dummy with the crossbow, I'm going to get an extra 8% onto my damage, final damage number. And then the mannequin modifier I briefly spoke about in this last video. Essentially, the mannequin counts as a proto cell. So when you have a look at all your weapons, you will have something, a little line of text here, and Jaws is suppression, deals more damage against deviants. If you shoot a deviant with this weapon, you actually do 25% more damage. If you don't match the weapon, so the dummy counts as a proto cell, so it doesn't match this because this does damage against deviants, you actually lose 5% damage. So I then need to take 5% off, so I'm going to times it by 0.95. Okay, so we just plug all those into a calculator. I've just done some testing there. 895 times 1.048, which is our full 4.8% weapon damage, times 1.02, which is our enemy type damage for normal enemies, times our debuff, which is 1.08, which is 8% from the crossbow for bullseye and vulnerability. And then we're going to take 5% off because we don't match the enemy. Actually, it's not enemy type. I just call it enemy faction, like deviants, protocell, and the other one. Cool. 981.59. Let's have a look at what we get. Now we need to proc bullseye and get the vulnerability for this to work. We're looking for a non-crit, 982. And we said, whoa, 981.59. So it rounds up to 982. Cool. That's working well. So you take that number, and if you get a crit, you times it by your total crit damage. This would be 25% on top of that number if I get a crit. You have to be careful with using just these stats here because there are very specific mods that won't change this stat, and this becomes really important later on. A really good example is on the mask. Something like Targeted Strike gives you crit damage plus 25% when you hit marked targets. This is not reflected in your overall stats. If I hit the target with a crossbow, mark it, and I have that on, you actually don't see the 25% jump in here. This is all the stuff I had to modify in my Excel spreadsheet to like make sure the damage was coming out correctly. So that's crit damage. If you shoot a head or a weak spot and you get that red number, that is our damage calculation before for a standard hit. Damage times weapon times enemy type times debuff times mannequin, and then it's just times by our weak spot bonus, which is here. Weak spot damage is 60%. The only thing that is a little bit different is when you get a critical hit on a weak spot. So that is the orange over a weak spot. That is a critical over the top of a weak spot, and the damage calculation for that is take our standard hit, which was the calculation we did before, and we times it by crit damage plus weak spot damage, right? So we had 982, and then we have a look at our crit damage, 25%, and our weak spot damage is 60%, right? So we had 982 times 1.85 times 1.85 equals 1815.94. Okay, let's have a look at what we get for a critical shot over a weak spot. Make sure we apply our crossbow because our calculation includes vulnerability. 816, 816, 816, 1816. What did we say? Pretty good. I said 1815. It gets rounded up to 1816. Great. That's basic calculations. Now let's look at status. Status and elemental damage, which is something maybe you haven't seen before. Now, the unfortunate thing with Unstable Bomber, it's very unstable. I want you to just pay attention to the status number here. What you'll notice is it fluctuates a lot. Now, nearly all of our damage calculations, we can get within 1 point of damage, like all the time. But for whatever reason, Unstable Bomber is unstable, and that number does fluctuate. The only thing that I can think of is what is happening is with Unstable Bomber, remember it has a damage decays over explosion distance. I wouldn't think that that should apply to the target that it's exploding on, but maybe it does. I mean, I guess it must have to. So like, technically what's happening is maybe an explosion happens here and you get damage decay, and then you see the number pop up over here. I would have thought the damage decay only applies to enemies around it. In the end of the day, it doesn't really matter. All you need to know is that this Unstable Bomber damage fluctuates, which makes working out damage formulas really difficult, right? We're up to 5,000. We've dropped back down. Let's go again. 4,200, 4,400, 4,500, 4,700, 4,900. 4,100. It changes a lot. So the way that we need to work out damage calculations for like status and elemental damage is use a different weapon that's way more consistent, and then we apply it to Unstable Bomber. So what we're actually going to do is use Power Surge because it is really consistent, and we can work out how elemental and status damage actually applies. So if you look at this gun, 633. It doesn't change. So this is going to be our test weapon for working out how status and elemental damage calculates. Okay, so for Power Surge, it has a slightly different damage calculation than Unstable Bomber, which we need to consider. And that's the status damage is only 50% of the PSI. If you look at Unstable Bomber, it was 100% of PSI. So we do need to like change a couple of things around, but we're still going to use Power Surge, and we just got to consider that in a calculation. So the damage calculation is this. We got a PSI divided by 2, take 50% off it, times status damage. So let's just have a look here, go back to our stats screen. I've unequipped everything else and just put a couple of things on. So PSI divided by 2 look at our status damage, which is 20%. So we times by 1.2. And then we times it by our elemental damage. So we have a look at elemental damage. We're at 6.4% here. Now, you'll notice that you have elemental damage divided into like the elements: blaze, frost, shock, explode. A lot of the time they'll all be the same, because when you get a mod, you often get something like this, like elemental damage, and it applies the same percentage to every element. However, there are some things that will just buff a specific element. So you do need to be careful of what you're actually looking at. So for power surge, we need to look at shock elemental damage, which is a 6.4%. We then times it by a debuff bonus. So this is also, once again, if I apply a crossbow with bullseye and it has vulnerability on it, it actually changes the status damage you get. So this actually adds an extra 8% off on for bullseye. And then also enemy type. This is all super valuable information for understanding how we're going to make the best build for unstable bomber. Like, enemy type also affects this. So we have a look at what the dummy is, which is a normal enemy type or a common enemy type, and that's 4%. And let's just do this calculation and see what we get. So we take the PSI 254, we halve it for power surge. Okay, we times it by 1.2, that's at 20% for our status. We times it by 1.064, that's at 6.4% for elemental damage. We times it by our debuff bonus, which is our crossbow, which is 8%, 1.08. And then we times it by our enemy type, 1.04. Now we don't get the mannequin like debuff, because that only applies to the bullets. Okay, so we don't have to minus 5% from this. Equals 182.13. So let's see if our damage calculation is correct. 182. Apply bullseye. Cool, 182. So we can be very, very confident that this damage calculation is correct for working out the status damages. Now we can apply it to unstable bomber. Some really key takeaway points here is status damage is multiplicative with elemental damage. And it's really confusing because people say, oh, like they're the same thing. They are the same thing, but they basically exist in different multiplier buckets. Your status damage goes in one bucket, your elemental damage goes in another bucket, and they multiply together to give you your overall status hit damage, okay? So they don't get added together like other things, like a crit and weak spot. They actually are separate multipliers. Also really good to know that our status hits get the debuff bonus, and they also get the enemy type bonus. So these are all important things when we're chasing mods that we don't want to neglect, because our status benefits from it as well. Okay, so let's apply all of this learning to Jaws. I'm going to use probably the more complicated calculation, which is your status damage after hitting a weak spot. And the reason why that is a little bit more complicated is, if you remember back to the weapon perks, after hitting a weak spot, gain explosion elemental damage plus 30% for 8 seconds. So this is how it looks. You take 100% of your PSI, which is in this case of 598. So here we go, 598 times our status damage. So let's have a look at our, so I've got a little bit of gear on. I'm going to talk you through this in a second. Our status damage is 22.4%, so times 1.224 times our elemental damage plus our explosive damage from hitting a weak spot. So we have a look at our elemental damage here, and remember it's an explosive one, so explode elemental damage is only at 3.2%. But when we get a weak spot hit, if we quickly open up a menu, you'll see that now we have the extra 30% on, right? So the 3.2 plus the 30% from hitting a weak spot brings our explode elemental damage to 33.2%. Then we want to times by unstable bomber damage. Now this is very similar to some of the shrapnel calculations. Different perks have their own damage buckets. Like there is a shrapnel damage bucket, there's a shrapnel damage crit bucket. Unstable bomber is no different and has like an unstable bomber damage bucket, and some perks activate that. So for example, reckless bomber, for every 1% crit, unstable bomber damage plus 0.5%. So if we go back over here, we have a look at our crit rate. Our crit rate is at 42.2%. So half of that is 21.1, and this is our unstable bomber damage bonus. So another multiplier. Now here's the tricky part. Anything that you have equipped that will change your crit rate stat here will also buff your unstable bomber. So for example, the Shaman Vulture top gives you crit rate plus 35% for 3 seconds. And you can keep reprocking it and you can keep it up. And what that means is this is going to get plus 35%. So let's just reload. Okay, so once we've got an explosion, quickly open our menu, go back. Our crit rate is now 77.2%. Our unstable bomber damage is now up to 38.6. So that now becomes our unstable bomber damage once the build is going. Once we get that first explosion from Shaman, because you get crit rate plus 35% once you trigger an unstable bomber explosion, okay? The important thing to note is there are some weapons that do not impact this crit rate. So for example, the recurve bow actually gives 15% crit rate, but it's only on the enemy you're shooting, and it doesn't technically impact this stat here, which means it doesn't impact the unstable bomber stat here. So don't think that, oh, I'm buffing crit rate by 15% here, so I'm also getting another 7.5% on unstable bomber. Similarly, with a mask mod, right, targeted strike gives you another 10% crit rate. However, when you do these things, right, the way to check to see if it's going to like impact it is, let me just reset my stats. 42.2, right? When I hit with this crossbow, I should get 15% crit rate. And because of my mask mod, I should get another 10. So this should change, right? Hold on. Put the gun back on. 42. 42 should go up. It doesn't. So that's just something to note. There are some perks that will give you technically a crit rate increase, but it doesn't actually change the stat here. And this is what the game uses to determine unstable bomber. Took me a while to work that out. Okay. Times our enemy type damage. So once again, the dummy is a common enemy. We find our common enemy type, which is 6%. So we times by 1.06. And then we look at our debuff bonus. So we are getting a debuff bonus from Bullseye. Remember, this gives us vulnerability, which is plus 8%. So we times it by 8%, 1.08. And then if we get a crit on the status explosion, we need to times it by our crit damage. And our crit damage here is 70%. This is where it gets tricky. But we actually get 25% crit damage from hitting a marked target. And this does work with, unlike the crit rate, which wasn't impacting, unlike the crit rate that wasn't impacting the unstable bomber, this crit damage does go on top, right? So we had to have to plus 25% to our stats here. And this is all what I did in the Excel spreadsheet. Okay. So if we do all of that, what do we get? 598 times 1.224, which is our status damage, times 1.332, which is our total elemental damage, times 1.386, which is our unstable bomber damage, times 1.06, which is our damage against common enemies, times 1.08, which is our debuff from vulnerability, times our crit damage, which is 1.95 once we've hit the marked target, and our mask mod is proccing. So 3,016 damage points. Now remember, unstable bomber is unstable and fluctuates heavily, but we predicted it'll be around 3,016. So I know from experience, it'll probably be around 3,000. Now hit to get the weak spot, and I'm going to come down here. 298, 295, Rock again. Almost 3,000, right? So you're getting, damage formula is getting very, very close to what we're predicting, and I apply that throughout the video. Okay, so what attributes do you want to focus on at your mods? Now, with this build, you can reach 100% crit rate. And obviously I'm going to go through the entire build. I'll just quickly show you that, yeah, you can make every single shot hit a crit and every status explosion to also crit. So what you're aiming for is to build into crit rate and crit damage. So for your mods, you want to pick violent mods as the suffix. You want to have so that means your primary attribute is going to be crit damage. Then if you can get a weapon damage, that's big. Then if you can get a, whatever you're farming, if you're doing great ones like bosses, you want damage against bosses. If you're doing stylos, damage against normal enemies will be good. Magazine capacity and reload is okay. We're going to talk about it a little bit later, but the magazine is so short for Jaws. You really need a lot of magazine capacity to make a difference. And also remember that every second hit, if you've got really high crit rate, is going to be explosions. So you kind of want an even magazine size too. So you don't want to go from 18 bullets to 19 bullets. You kind of want to go from 18 bullets to 20 bullets. Personally, I think just to make it easy to understand and simplified, crit damage, weapon damage, and then a damage against the enemy type that you're farming, and then just take whatever else you can get. If you get those three, you're like going very well. Congratulations, you've graduated from the mathematics portion of this video. Now let's talk about the actual build, starting with the weapon customization. Looking at the magazine, the extended pistol magazine is very nice because what it allows you to do is when you combine that with at least one piece from the Lone Wolf set, gives you another 10% magazine capacity. You can get a total of 18 bullets. Now I have 19 in the magazine at the moment, and that's because one of my mods must have magazine capacity on it. Which one is it? Is it this one? Guys, this has magazine capacity fully tiered up to 12%. And this is why I said I don't really prioritize magazine capacity, because that's at the max level and I got one extra bullet. Okay, so that's why I prefer to prioritize more weapon, enemy type damage, weapon damage, etc. So the extended pistol mag combined with one piece of Lone Wolf is fantastic to give you 18 bullets in the magazine. And 18, if you crit on all 18, it means you're going to get 9 explosions. Cool. When it gets to ammo, of course, you make the best ammo that you can for the resources you can do. The damage goes up with each tier, so you get damage per shot, 5%. PSI intensity also goes up, but it gets tricky when you get towards the end, especially with these AP rounds. So the tungsten pistol AP round is 15% damage per shot and 15% intensity, but you might be tempted by the blasting pistol AP, which says triggering shock or unstable bomber increases PSI intensity by 12% for 3 seconds. And it also has another 15% PSI intensity. So total of increasing your PSI by 27%. So is an increase of 27% PSI better than getting 15% on damage and 15% on PSI from that? Now, you actually lose damage. This is not what you want to build. The blasting pistol AP ammo, do not build this for the Jaws. You actually will lose damage compared to the tungsten pistol AP rounds. To be honest, most of you will probably just craft the normal tungsten pistol ammo, but just in case you're tempted, you will lose damage. Let me tell you what the numbers are. If you use the tungsten AP rounds over the blasting AP rounds, you do 8.63% more damage to the body, even the body crit shots, and you do 8.97% more damage to weak spots. When it comes to the other accessories, this is really, are you playing on a mouse and keyboard? Are you playing on a controller? And what do you need to control this weapon? Because this all affects stability and accuracy. I started off with max accuracy to see if I prefer that. Then I ended up going to max stability. I seem to prefer that a little bit better. Remember, they want you to hit they want you to hit weak spots. So you do try to need to aim for weak spots. I would play around with what combinations suit you best to try to hit weak spots when you can. If you want to know where to find any of these, just basically go onto Once Human Map Genie. You just type in what the mod is called here. So for example, let's say you don't have the extended mag yet. Type in extended pistol, was it magazine? Search extended pistol mag, bing bong bang. That's where it's located. Shows you how to do it. Go and get it. So go and experiment with the other accessories. It's going to be personal preference. When it can't, definitely get the extended magazine, and then don't use blasting rounds. Okay, let's talk about calibrations. This was probably one of the biggest bits of feedback from the last couple of videos, is like people wanted calibrations. I found them really tough to test. They're in limited supply. They're hard to get, blah, blah, blah. But let's talk about calibrations for the jaws. I think the two main calibrations people are going to be looking at, because they directly impact your damage, is the precision style, which has attack plus 25%, range plus 40%, but the fire rate is decreased. And then you have, see, my calibrations are spread across Eternal Land and my normal game. And then you have a rapid shot calibration, which does fire rate plus 25%, magazine capacity plus 40, but the attack goes down. So one has plus 25% attack, lower fire rate. This has less attack, higher fire rate, and bigger magazine. So there's like a whole bunch of stuff to consider to do like a calculation on what is better. And of course, then you have like, what do you want on that? Do you want elemental damage? Do you want crit rate? Do you want something else? Cool. Let's get the easy part out the way first, and that is you want crit rate on this. Remember, every single bullet counts. You can get 100% crit rate by building into double crit rate on your calibrations. This will allow you to reach 100% crit rate. That means every single bullet's going to crit. That means you're going to get an explosion every second bullet. Great. Definitely go for crit rate. But which one is better, rapid shot or the precision style? Now, what we need to do is actually work out a calculation for fire rate and incorporate magazine capacity in that too. Now, when I first started doing these videos, I didn't actually realize that this was just rounds per minute. I just didn't seem to make sense for me. I know that a lot of the time, like fire rate is always rounds per minute, but I thought, oh, they must just be using a different stat. But if you actually go into like, where is it? The assistant, and you go in here and you ask, what is the fire rate? It actually tells you it's rounds per minute. Okay, so we know that our stat is rounds per minute, which means we can work out how many rounds this gun shoots per second. So what we do is it does 256 rounds per minute. And this, by the way, is irrespective of magazine capacity. This is like if you had unlimited bullets in the magazine, it would shoot 256 rounds in a minute. Okay, so 256 divided by 60 is going to give us our rounds per second. And then we know for the one I'm using right now, because I got some mods on, I actually have 19 bullets in the magazine rather than 18. And we need to shoot 19 bullets, right? So, and we know that we're shooting 4.26666 bullets per second. So how many seconds does it take to empty the magazine? Okay, so we go 19 divided by 4.26666, whatever, recurring. 4.45 seconds to empty the entire magazine with this setup, okay? And right now I'm using the rapid shot style. Now at first I was like, there's no way. There's no way I'm shooting the entirety of the magazine in like 4.5 seconds. This is why my camera's flipped around so you can see these numbers, because I had to prove this to myself too, because I was like, there's no way I'm shooting the entire magazine in 4.5 seconds. There you go. I just can't press it quick enough, 4.8. So we know how long it takes to empty an entire magazine. We can do the math on this now, work out whether it's better to have fire rate and less damage, or more damage and less fire rate, and magazine capacity changing all at once. So when you do this calculation, the time to clear the magazine with rapid shot is 4.53 seconds. The time to clear the magazine with precision is 4.56 seconds. Literally, not literally, very close to being the exact same time. It's 0.03 seconds difference, which means you can just take the total damage per magazine and compare them directly without having to do anything else funky. So if you use rapid shot over precision style, you do 2.41% more damage on body shots, and you do 1.9% more damage on weak spot shots. Very, very little difference. So what I would do, because calibrations are hard to come by, is just prioritizing getting double crit rate for either rapid shot or precision shot. Ask your server if anyone's got double crit rate in either of those things, and you'll be doing really well. Okay, let's talk about armor sets. Starting with the top, you're definitely going to want on, which is the Shaman Vulture top. After triggering Unstable Bomber, your crit rate gets plus 35% for 3 seconds, and this reprocs every time you get Unstable Bomber. This is what pushes you up to 100% crit rate, meaning every bullet starts critting. So usually what you'll find, as soon as you get that first Unstable Bomber proc, you'll be up either at 90 or 100% crit rate, and then every single bullet's going to crit, and you're going to get more Unstable Bomber, and so this is going to just maintain that the whole time. Easily the best top you need to have on. The thing that is probably more arguable is, do we want, or like what you might be thinking is, do we want the Lone Wolf set or do we want the Bastille set? So the Lone Wolf set has a lot of really good options that are good for a Jaws build. It has magazine capacity, which is great. When you pair that with the extended pistol mag, you're going to get 18 rounds, which is really nice. A flat crit rate of 5% in the second column, which is great for a Reckless Bomber, because remember, every crit rate we increase for Reckless Bomber, we actually get 0.5% in our Unstable Bomber. So any like flat crit rate stats is really good for this build. And then you get 1 stack of Lone Wolf, which is 6% crit damage for 30 seconds every second crit. So what that would look like, and it can stack up to 8 times in the third column, up to 10 times if you get the full Lone Wolf set. So if you've got 18 bullets in the magazine and they are all critting, so your first bullet crits, your second bullet crits, that means you get 6% added on there. And then your third bullet crits and your fourth bullet crits, then you get another 6%, right? So after every second crit, you're going to have another 6% added on. And this is for, each of them lasts for 30 seconds. So there will come a point where you have max stacks. And one here. So how many is that? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And then technically after your final round, if you have 18 bullets in the magazine, you'll get a 9th stack. And then the first 2 bullets in the next magazine will then give you your final 10th stack for a full Lone Wolf of 10. So thing is, the first magazine is a slow accumulation of crit damage compared to something like Bastille. Now the Bastille set has your first column is weapon damage plus 10% when your HP is over 70%, reload speed 20%, which is good because what it allows you to do, it gives you a little bit more breathing room to continually to proc Shaman, because Shaman lasts for 3 seconds, right? So you want this to stay up between your reloads. So the second column of Bastille is actually pretty nice to reload a little bit quicker and get back into doing damage to keep the Shaman re-procking. And then the third column is what you're most likely interested in, which you get a 40% weapon damage buff just by ducking down, but you have to be immobile. So then you're probably thinking, well, what's better? 40% straight off the bat on weapon damage or accumulation of crit damage? And you could probably suspect what is better. For the very first magazine, while Lone Wolf is ramping up, Bastille is actually a better option. So just for that 1 magazine burst damage, Bastille is better. Let me tell you what the number is. It does about 9% more body shot damage and about 12% more weak spot damage on that very first magazine using Bastille over Lone Wolf. Now, what happens once Lone Wolf is all ramped up and you've got the 10 procs, so that's going to happen during your second magazine, the tables do turn and Lone Wolf does around 10.7, around 11% more body damage and around 4% more weak spot damage once everything is built up. So for your sustained damage, you do want to go for a full set of Lone Wolf, then have on a Shaman top, and then I would put on just a single Bastille helmet or whatever slot you want to use, one single Bastille to get the weapon damage, and just going to have to deal with not getting the reload speed. Okay, I want to address a bit of feedback about how I wasn't giving much attention to the damage differences change depending on how much stats you've got built into crit or weapon damage already. And then just like if you just compare things by themselves, they actually will change once you've got your full build. So I thought this would be a good time to address that feedback because we're doing armor sets. And this is the best way that I can explain it. And hopefully this makes sense and hopefully this addresses that feedback. So we know that crit damage stacks multiplicatively with weapon damage. And what that means is if we've got something like 895 damage, like that's what our base damage of our bullets do. And let's say we've theoretically got some stat points to spend. If we put all of those stat points into crit damage, let's just say we put 60% into crit damage and we put 0% into weapon damage. What does this damage look like? Now, there's a couple things we need to do differently, but let's just go with me for a second and I'll give you the if, buts, and ands. So 895 times 1.6, okay, 60% crit damage equals 1432. Okay, equals 1432. Now, let's say that we split those stat points and we have 30% in crit damage and we have 30% in weapon damage. So now we do 895 times 1.3 for the crit times 1.3 for the weapon. Okay, 1512 is our new damage. So we do more damage when we split our stats across two multiplier buckets. Now, it's not as simple as that because you have to remember that our crit is doing the crit damage is increasing on bullet number 1, crit damage is increasing on bullet number 2, and crit damage is also being applied to the explosion, but on weapon damage, it's just weapon damage being applied to bullet number 1, weapon damage being applied to bullet number 2. But the general principle is you don't really want to stack all your stats into one bucket, okay? You want to spread them over multiple buckets, and in this build, we are doing crit damage and weapon damage. So when we look at the armor options, what happens when we have a full build and we have attributes? Let's just have a quick look on, I think I've got a boot here. Right, so covered advance, my primary attribute is crit damage and it's maxed to 15%. What happens when we have 15% crit damage on every single thing? How does that change the damage differences? Also, we get a huge whack of weapon damage from other things in the game. Our Cradle Override can give about 40 to 45% weapon damage. And depending on what deviation we use, like if we use a, let's say you have a skill rating 3 on the Mini Feaster, this can give up to 84% weapon damage, right? So now we've got a bucket of, let's say, around 120% weapon damage, and we've got another bucket of already 15, 30, 30, 60, 90 crit damage. So I tried to give like a hypothetical of like an end game build. Your Cradle Overrides all being used. Your Deviations have been used perfectly. You have gold roll tiers on each armor piece. Like, what does the damage differences start looking like? So a full Lone Wolf set with 10 stacks of Lone Wolf, so the fourth column, once it's fully going, will do more damage than Bastille. There's about 9% to the body and about 5% to the weak spot. So still Lone Wolf comes out on top with your end game build once everything is up and running. Congratulations, you've made it to the weapon mod section of this video. So we want to look at the weapon mods in Unstable Bomber. Starting at the top, heavy explosives. Unstable Bomber inflicts stagger, so this is not going to increase your damage when you shoot small enemies. They get staggered when you trigger the Unstable Bomber explosion. So we're not really looking at this because it doesn't increase your damage. I don't particularly like it for ad control either. I'd rather just do more damage and finish the enemy off. Then we have Bombardier Souvenir. When triggering Unstable Bomber, automatically refill 10% of your magazine. So the way this works is this refills it from your your inventory. So however many bullets you have on you, it will refill from that and it'll do 10% into your current magazine. if you have 18 bullets in your magazine, you actually get 1 bullet back per explosion. So what it would look like is this: 18 bullets. If every bullet crits, right, you're going to get 9 explosions, and every time you cause an unstable bomber explosion, you get a bullet. So for every explosion is an extra bullet. So now you're at 27 bullets total. But now, because you got 9 extra bullets, if every single one of those also crit, right, you're going to get more bullets back. Remember, 9 divided by 2 is like 4.5. So we round down. So you're going to get another 4 bullets from that. It's going to take you to 31. If every single one of those bullets crit, you're going to get another 2 explosions and another 2 bullets back. You're going to get 33 total. Now, this is pretty easy to check because you just basically monitor. I just put it into Adobe. I checked how many bullets I had in my magazine when I started shooting, checked how many bullets I had when I finished the magazine, and yeah, did confirm it was around 32 to 33 bullets. It does depend on when the last unstable bomber procs. You can get 33, but you can get a little bit less because you actually start the animation reload before you fire off the last bullet. But we'll use 33 in our calculations. So we're going to be comparing a magazine capacity of 33 compared to our other options. So the other options are Reckless Bomber. For every 1% crit rate, unstable bomber damage plus 0.5%. So half your crit rate becomes unstable bomber damage. Like I said at the beginning of this video, Reckless Bomber only takes whatever number is in here. So at the moment, the crit rate is 42.2%, and that's giving you unstable bomber damage of 21.1%. Shaman Vulture Top will increase this stat number here. So when you actually get an explosion and you get increase in my crit rate, 77.2% now, because it's got 35% from the Shaman Top, you'll find that now our unstable bomber damage is increased 38.6%. It does not work with the crit rate bonuses you get from the bow. It doesn't work with the crit rate bonuses you get from targeted strike. So Reckless Bomber gives us half our crit rate as unstable bomber damage. And the last one is Supercharge, which says triggering unstable bomber grants unstable bomber damage plus 5% for 3 seconds and can stack up to 6 times. So you can get 6 times 5, you can get 30% unstable bomber damage. And it increments. So you get 5% first and 10%, then 15% all the way up. Here's the thing. If you have at least 60% crit rate, half of that is 30%, this does the same thing, and you can get more than 30%. And it starts straight away compared to Supercharge, which slowly builds up. And because we're building into crit rate, Reckless Bomber is our better option. So there's no real need to compare Supercharged here. Reckless Bomber is going to outperform it straight out of the gate. So we want to compare Reckless Bomber to Bombardier Souvenir. As you have probably guessed by now, I like to visualize everything. This really helps me out. So here we have damage per bullet, and here we have time. Okay, and then we're going to have our Reckless Bomber, which is going to have more damage per bullet, but it's going to have a shorter magazine, so it's only going to have 18 bullets in the magazine. Our damage stops here. We're reloading. We're not doing any damage, and then it continues. Then we're going to have Bombardier Souvenir, which is going to have more in the magazine, okay, but do less damage. So it's going to have 33. This is obviously not to scale. 33 bullets in the magazine before you have to reload, and then reloads, and then keeps going. So I did a number of calculations, and obviously it depends on when you reload and how big your DPS window is. So if we take this time here, right, when we empty the entire magazine of Bombardier Souvenir, obviously Reckless Bomber is losing out on damage because you have to do a reload, right? So you have, and we know all the maths behind this. We know how much damage you do per bullet. We know how long it takes to empty a magazine. We know the rounds per minute, blah, blah, blah. Like I basically punched this all in. I'm just showing you which points in time I measured. So we can measure this here, and we're expecting that Bombardier Souvenir is going to do a lot more damage because it's doing damage during the reload phase. Alternatively, we can also measure here, right, which would be like our burst damage. So let's just call this sustained damage, okay, sus. And let's call this burst damage, right? So we can also measure at this point, how much damage Reckless Bomber does after a full magazine compared to Bombardier Souvenir. So 18 bullets compared to this not doing as much damage. We can also compare, well, what happens if we have 2 rounds of magazines, right? So we finish this magazine. So we have 1 magazine of Reckless, 2nd magazine of Reckless, and how does that compare as well? So 2 magazines of Reckless Bomber versus 33 of Bombardier Souvenir, reload, and then go again. And this is like, I guess, another version of sustained damage. What does the best? So our first damage calculation is just when Bombardier Souvenir gets to clear its entire magazine, 33 bullets, and Reckless does 18 reloads, and then gets a little bit more damage here, and it ends there. What does that look like? As expected, Bombardier Souvenir is going to do more damage because Reckless has to reload during that time. So if you use Bombardier Souvenir over Reckless, and the time period is 1 magazine of Bombardier Souvenir, you're going to do 37.55% more damage to body shots and 38.2% more damage on weak spots. Right. But what about our burst damage here? So over the time period of just 1 magazine of Reckless, how much damage do you do there? So Reckless Bomber versus Bombardier Souvenir over 1 Reckless magazine. Body shots, Reckless will do 8.32% more damage to the body and 7.84% more damage to the weak spot. And this approximately 8% more damage for like your burst damage for Reckless is repeated over 2 magazines. So when you do 2 magazines of Reckless and you have to reload from Bombardier Souvenir, it's like 9% more damage. So the only time that Bombardier Souvenir is basically outperforming Reckless is when that DPS window is exactly around 33 bullets. Now, the reason why I choose Reckless over Bombardier Souvenir is because the time to empty the magazine of 18 bullets is like 4.5 seconds. And you compare that to the time to empty the 33 bullets, it's like 8.3 seconds. Now, most of your Cradle mods you'll find are around 4 seconds long. So for example, one of the Cradle mods where you get weapon damage when you reload, it lasts for 4 seconds. So you have much better efficiency or like timing of reprocking your weapon Cradle perks because most of them go for like around 4 seconds. So that is why I prefer Reckless. It has better burst damage, great for running silos and just shooting small enemies, and it has better sustained damage as long as you can get 2 magazines out. And it also has better synergy with your Cradle perks because of the time to empty the magazine. Okay, let's have a look at helmet mods, starting with Fateful Strike. Cannot deal weak spot damage, crit rate plus 10%, and crit damage plus 30%. A couple of things to note, even though it says you cannot deal weak spot damage, you still proc the elemental buff you get from Jaws. So Jaws has as a weapon feature, after hitting a weak spot, gain explosion elemental damage plus 30%. If you have Fateful Strike on, you still get this benefit. Fateful Strike mainly applies, well, it applies to your weak spot damage bonus. So what that means is when you hit a weak spot, you don't get this 60%, but you still technically can hit the weak spot and proc other things like the weapon perk of Jaws. Now, the other thing is you get the 10% crit rate as well. And remember, if you are running Reckless Bomber, which I recommend, for every percent of crit rate, you get Unstable Bomber damage. So that 10% crit rate is going to give you 5% extra of Unstable Bomber damage as well, which is really nice. And of course, we're doing a crit rate, crit damage build. So having 30% crit damage is pretty huge. It means every second bullet, when we crit on a bullet, it's going to do 30% more. Plus the status explosion is also going to crit as well, benefiting from that crit damage. So this is looking very juicy and probably already we're thinking a pretty good pick. Okay, Deviation Expert, range minus minus 25%. So your range is like damage fall off. So as you get further and further away from a target, eventually you'll start seeing damage fall off. And so that will impact that stat. Now I have tested it and I'll just show you. It's like the difference from like shooting here to shooting here. It is, I don't know what the calculation is for the range, like damage fall off, but the 25% is quite manageable and I don't think it's a huge disadvantage. So I wouldn't worry about that too much. And then we get a fire rate plus 10%. So we're going to have to do some calculations for that. And we get status damage plus 20%. So that means our explosions are going to have 20% added onto that. Elemental Havoc does elemental damage plus 10%, and when HP is above 90, another 10%. So this is 20% elemental damage, and this is 20% status damage, but also has fire rate. Now we know from how our buffs stack that status damage and elemental damage stack the same, so automatically we're thinking Deviation Expert is already the better pick here because it has the fire rate, and I don't think the range negative really makes too much of a difference. Work of Proficiency says when reloading an empty magazine, so you got to empty a whole magazine first before you get the benefit. Reloading speed plus 10%, which is okay because it allows us to keep reprocking stuff. Elemental damage plus 20%. So these are all looking the same. Elemental damage 20%, elemental damage 20%, status damage 20%, but this has fire rate. So once again, Deviation Expert is looking like the best option so far out of these three. Then we have Momentum Up, fire rate plus 10% for the first 50% of the magazine, and then weapon damage for 30% for the next 50% of the magazine. Now this is, I'm assuming, bugged because you actually only get 25% weapon damage. But interesting mod. Momentum Up performs very well in lots of other builds. We're going to have to test that out. Precision Strike, hitting a weak spot grants a weak spot damage plus 12% for 3 seconds and can stack 3 times. That's going to be a 36% increase on weak spot damage. And finally, mag expansion when reloading an empty magazine capacity plus 30%. Now I'm not going to include this because this is going to be very similar results to our weapon mods, which is like if the DPS window is exactly 30% of the magazine and you're forced, that's going to be the best option. But for the most part, we know that 18 bullets in the magazine takes 4 seconds, or like a bit over 4 seconds to empty the magazine, and this has really good synergy with all our Cradle perks, so we're going to discount this unless you find a very specific boss that's damage window is exactly that 30% magazine capacity. Cool. So now we want to compare Faithful Strike to all of these, Momentum Up and Precise Strike. What are the results? So if we are shooting the body and we are critting on the body and we have a nice high crit rate, this is the difference. If you use Faithful Strike over Deviation Expert, you're going to get 19.1% more damage using Faithful Strike. And of course, because of the way damage stacking, this is the same for Elemental Havoc, because that also just has the 20% elemental damage. It's also the same, 19.1 for Work of Proficiency. When it comes to Momentum Up, I'm going to get to, sorry, this is not including fire rate yet. This is just a full magazine. So this, I'm going to give you the stats for fire rate in a moment. So this is a full magazine. Against Momentum Up, you have a 14.4%. So once again, Faithful Strike is 14.4% better than Momentum Up for a full magazine. Against Precise Strike, now obviously this just does weak spots. This is not getting any benefits from doing body damage, and that is 25.2%. Faithful Strike is 25.2% better than that. Okay, now let's look at our weak spot damage. Once again, I'm going to compare everything to Faithful Strike. Now, we expect Faithful Strike to start falling down here because it can't do weak spot damage, but we also expect it not to fall down too much because it's got 30% crit damage on it. So when it comes to Deviation Expert, well, actually every other mod outperforms Faithful Strike when it comes to weak spot damage. So Deviation has 4.5% more damage than Faithful Strike. Elemental Havoc has 3.4% more damage than Faithful Strike. Now, the reason why these are not identical for weak spot damage, but they are identical in the differences for the body shot damage, is because Elemental Havoc is stacking additively with, when you get a weak spot, you get explosion elemental damage. So you're getting 30% plus your 20% elemental damage. Whereas your Deviation Expert is status damage, and that's stacking multiplicatively with that explosion damage. So that's why this is slightly less. Work of Proficiency is also elemental damage that ends up having the same difference. It is 3.4% more damage than Faithful Strike. Momentum Up is 9.1% better than Faithful Strike. And Precise Strike is 9.7% better than Faithful Strike. Once again, this is not including fire rate yet. This is just one full magazine. So we can have a look at this and we can see that Momentum Up has the lowest difference for body shots, right? Faithful Strike is absolutely destroying everything else. And the difference with Momentum Up is 14. And it also has the second highest Precise Strike shots at 9.1. The highest was Precise Strike, which was 9.7, but like 0.6 of a difference. And you got to remember that Precise Strike does nothing for body shots, whereas Momentum Up does. So if you start missing weak spots, Momentum Up is going to start performing better. Cool. We're also thinking now fire rates, and the two things that have fire rate is Momentum Up and Deviation Expert. So now we want to compare Faithful Strike to Deviation Expert, Faithful Strike to Momentum Up, and start looking at what's better now with fire rate. Okay, to help visualize how I measured fire rate between Faithful Strike versus Deviation Expert, we have the damage per bullet over here, and we have over time down here. And the purple line is going to be Faithful Strike. It's got a high damage per bullet because we got crit plus 30 on all our crits, plus status damage is benefiting from it. Longer to finish the magazine though, reload, start shooting again. And it's a slower fire rate. Let's pretend these are bullets. This is like the cadence of shooting. Obviously nothing's to scale here. This is just how we visualize. Our Deviation Expert has less damage per bullet. However, it's going to finish the magazine quicker and is also shooting faster. Bang, 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 bang. Right, and then reloads and starts going again. So the difference in this section here for your burst damage, taking into consideration the fire rate of Deviation Expert, is this. So Faithful Strike gets 16 bullets out, and if they all crit, you're going to get 8 explosions. Whereas Deviation Expert obviously finishes its entire magazine, so you get the full 18 bullets, and if all of them crit, then you're going to get 9 explosions. So that ends up being the damage difference, so let me show you that. So when we consider fire rate, before Faithful Strike was doing 19.1% more damage to the body, and once we consider fire rate and do that burst damage, it drops down to only 5.8% better than Deviation Expert. And before, Deviation Expert was doing 4.5% more damage on weak spots than Faithful Strike. And then once we consider the fire rate, it jumps up to 17.6%. Now, this is looking much better once we start including fire rate in the calculations. It's dropped the difference on body shots down a lot, and it's improved the weak spot damage. Very nice. However, do remember, the longer your DPS phase is and the more magazines Faithful Strike gets in, these numbers start returning as well. So this is really for your burst damage, and that's what you really want for fire rate, right? You want to burst damage, reposition, burst damage, reposition. Okay, because Deviation Expert did so well when we started including the fire rate in the calculation, we are of course interested in how Momentum Up performs once we factor in the fire rate plus 10% in the first half of the magazine. The calculation becomes a little bit tricky because we got to compare like a first half of the magazine with the fire rate, and then the fire rate changes again, but then we get weapon damage plus 30%. Well, actually, it's only 25% because I think there's a bug for it with it. So I did then compare Momentum Up to Deviation Expert, and it was less than 1% on both body shots and weak spots. So Deviation Expert did 0.92% better on body, and it did 0.69% better on weak spots. So like I said, less than 1% difference when you start factoring in fire rate for both Deviation Expert and Momentum Up. So what that means is if you're running a build and there is a weak spot that is easily hit, and you can hit weak spots, or the boss has a weak spot and you can target that weak spot, you want to select either Momentum Up or Deviation Expert. And because they are within like 1% difference, you need to pick whichever one has better primary attributes or secondary attributes I wouldn't really worry too much about the range, negative 25% on Deviation Expert. I would still prioritize your primary and secondary attributes first because they're so close in damage difference. Here is your summary for the helmet mods. If a boss does not have a weak spot or has a hard to hit weak spot, or you can't hit weak spots like you're just shooting like smaller enemies, then Fateful Strike is the best mod to equip for body shot damage. If you can regularly hit weak spots or the boss has an easy weak spot that you can hit, you want to prioritize either Deviation Expert or Momentum Up. The damage difference between these, once you factor in the fire rate, is like less than 1%. So choose your best Momentum Up or your best Deviation Expert based on their primary and secondary attributes. Now let's take a look at the mask mods, and you've probably seen from every build video ever that Targeted Strike is the preferred mask mod for Unstable Bomber, specifically Jaws build, because it has crit rate and crit damage, and we know because of the stacking that this is really good for a Jaws build. However, there are some other mods that have probably got your attention: Pinpoint Strike, Delayed Blast, and Retrusion Explosion. Pinpoint Strike because it talks about Unstable Bomber, Delayed Blast because it also talks about the ultimate unstable bomber, which is a new terminology we need to talk about, and Retrusion Explosion because it has a whopping crit damage of 40%. So let's go through these and just have a look at the numbers. Starting with Pinpoint Strike. So what this does is when Unstable Bomber hits only one enemy, Unstable Bomber final damage plus 25%. I'll be real with you, this kind of confuses me, this mod. Well, I understand how it should work, but I don't know if it's actually working. So I'm assuming when it says only hits one enemy, it's talking about the blast radius. So if I shoot this enemy here and these guys get caught in the blast radius, my Unstable Bomber damage should be less than if I just shoot a single enemy. I'll just show you what it kind of looks like because I'm not seeing a huge difference in the damage numbers. This could be because, like, you know, Unstable Bomber has like huge variation in its actual explosion damage. So let's just have a quick look. All right, so we're getting up to 32, around 3,200, right? 3,247. It got up to around 3,200 on a group of enemies. Come over here. I do have some other gear on, so I just got to wait for Bastille to activate again. So around 3,200. So this should be more than 3,200, right? Around 3,200. I don't know. I don't know if it's actually working properly. Now, regardless if it's bugged or not, I did do the math and just gave it the benefit of the doubt that it's going to get an extra 25% damage on the Unstable Bomber final damage. And what that looked like is for body shots, so Targeted Strike versus Pinpoint Strike on the body. If you use Targeted Strike instead of Pinpoint Strike, you did a whopping 23.77% more damage using Targeted Strike. And versus the weak spots, if you use Targeted Strike over Pinpoint, you did 19.19% more damage using Targeted Strike. So even if it wasn't bugged, or maybe I'm misinterpreting this, even just doing the math and giving it the extra 25%, you're still better off using Targeted Strike. Okay, let's talk about Delayed Blast because this has some unusual terminology. Specifically, it says the bomb's ultimate damage plus 25%. What does that mean? Now, this is kind of hard to test because this perk itself, this armor mod itself, is not really well suited to Jaws overall, because what it says is before the bomb explodes, for every 5 hits taken, the bomb's ultimate damage plus 25%. So what it relies on is having a delay on Unstable Bomber, and Jaws doesn't do that. What another gun does is, I think it's a Little Jaws, right? Where's me Little Jaws? Right. Little Jaws has Unstable Bomber delay 0.3 seconds, and for every 0.1 second of Unstable Bomber delay, Unstable Bomber damage plus 20%. So like Little Jaws build is all about like delaying that explosion and getting buffs because of that. So this mod is actually suited to Little Jaws. And I'm assuming when it says things like for every 5 hits taken, I'm assuming it's talking about the enemies taking 5 hits. So you shoot, like the unstable bomber is delayed. You get 5 more hits in. And this is going to buff your ultimate damage, right? So straight off the bat, we know this is not really suited to Jaws, but it's interesting to understand what ultimate damage is because you might use this in other builds. Now, the way that I tested this is I went back to using the Outsider because this has, if you remember back to our weapon damage testing, Power Surge is a much better perk to use to do the maths because it's like really exact. And there is a mod in here. It is, all right, so I can add Power Surge on my weapon mod here. If the first attribute line, it's got Power Surge damage, but there's also a mask mod that talks about ultimate Power Surge damage. Here we go. So first shock electrocution for enemies without Power Surge status. Power Surge's ultimate damage plus 30%. So what I did is I put this on and started testing with this to work out what it means by ultimate damage. So you'll see here my first electrocution is like 764, and then everything drops down to 588. Once you do all the math on it, what you work out is when it says ultimate damage, it's actually like another multiplier bucket. So what it happens is you have ultimate damage. Let's just take Power Surge, for example. You have ultimate Power Surge damage and you have normal Power Surge damage. So in this example, the weapon mod has Power Surge damage plus a 3.6% as one of its primary attributes. So that actually goes into this bucket here, 3.6. And then the ultimate damage for Power Surge, which is coming from the mask mod, for enemies without Power Surge stated, Power Surge ultimate damage plus 30%. That actually goes in this bucket. So when you see, and yeah, so I did the math on this, and it is multiplicative. I tried it, adding them together. It did not work. It did not give me the exact value. Multiply them together and you actually get the exact value for ultimate damage. So what it means is when you see ultimate damage in weapon mods, what it's basically saying is the game's giving you another multiplier bucket to put stuff in rather than adding it to something else like the Power Surge that already exists. So for unstable bomber, you would have your unstable bomber damage buckets, and you also have your unstable bomber like ultimate damage bucket. Okay, and finally, let's compare Retrusion Explosion, and this gives crit damage plus 40% against enemies with burn, which is, you know, on paper seems pretty good if you can get someone to apply burn. Like if you're in a team and someone's already applying burn, cool. You don't need to mark a target. You get a 40+% on your crit damage, or you might just need to be throwing a Molotov. You probably don't want to be crafting a lot of Molotovs every single time if you're like grinding a silo, but if you're doing the raid, like the LEA lab, maybe just want to, you know, have Molotovs for the final encounter, that might be fine. Also, there are Cradle perks that give you weapon damage bonuses for using tools on bosses too. So you might be throwing a Molotov already. So this is something that's always caught my attention to wonder whether it's better. And the main difference is going to come down to how you mark targets, which I actually didn't mention before, so we probably should mention that now, is how do you mark targets with targeted strike? Because there are multiple ways you can mark a target. And what you'll likely see is either people using, well, the sweaty DPS is to use the recurve crossbow. The reason why that's always used in like videos is because you get an extra 15% crit rate on top of your targeted strike. So you get 15% crit rate from your bow itself. Then you get the 10% crit rate from targeted strike. So you're getting 25% crit rate, which in some circumstances pushes you up to 100% crit rate. Okay. So that's why you always see that bow. But you have to hit a weak spot shot for this to work. And it's obviously got a pretty long reload. So it's really good for that first shot, first encounter, massive burst damage. And hopefully the boss dies immediately. But follow-up shots, you have to reload the crossbow, re-aim, and hopefully they don't move very much. And they've got a really easy to hit weak spot. My preference, if I want to play a little bit more casually and just sit back and relax, is usually the AWS Bingo. You can mark targets just by switching to this weapon, and the very first shot of this weapon will cause bullseye, It's really easy. It's really easy to apply. It's very quick to apply. That's quite nice. And the last, but you don't get the 15% like you do with the crossbow. And the last option is your wildfire, which also has a chance to trigger bullseye. It's a less of a chance. It's only 60% chance to trigger bullseye, but it actually does inherently spread to other enemies in the area. So good for running silos and you have multiple enemies and you have bullseye spread. And if it doesn't spread, you get a weapon damage boost. Cool. So depending on what you pick changes some of the damage values. Obviously, crossbow is going to have the best damage with targeted strike because you get an extra 15%. So what do the numbers look like? Right, so if you're using crossbow and using targeted strike instead of retrusion explosion, on body shots, you're going to do about 13% more damage, and on weak spots, you're going to do about 12% more damage on the weak spots. Now, if you don't use the crossbow, so you don't have that extra 15% crit rate, and you use bingo or wildfire, those numbers are going to change just slightly because your retrusion explosion is going to do a little bit better this time, and it changes to about 8% difference on body and weak spot shots. So you'd still do 8% more damage on targeted strike if you're using bingo or your wildfire than using retrusion explosion. Okay, mask summary time. Targeted strike is easily your best mod to equip for a Jaws build. You can either use a recurve bow to mark targets, but you have to hit a weak spot, and that will give you another 15% crit rate, which is fantastic. Or you can use the AWS bingo or the wildfire to mark targets, but you won't get that 15% crit rate. Regardless of what you use to mark target, it is still the best mod to have on. It outperforms pinpoint strike, which I think is bugged at the moment. Even so, I gave the benefit of the doubt and mathed out its core effect, and targeted strike does more damage. Delayed blast is really not suited to Jaws. It is really for little Jaws where you delay unstable bomber, so that doesn't work either. And targeted strike still does more damage than retrusion explosion, which gives you a big 40% crit damage against enemies with burn. Targeted strike still does better. It's your best mask mod. Okay, let's talk about mods for the gloves. Crit Amplifier is your best mod, but there are some close seconds, and it also depends on what you're using to mark targets. Okay, let me show you what some of these numbers look like. If you use the crossbow to mark your targets, crit amplifier, and you use crit amplifier over crit boost, you're going to do around 4% more damage to the body and around 3% more damage to weak spots. So pretty close for crit boost if you're using the crossbow to mark targets. Same principle. So if I use crit amplifier with a crossbow compared to elemental overload, you're going to do around 9% more body damage and around 4% more weak spot damage for crit amplifier. If you use, once again, against status enhancement, using crit amplifier is going to give you around 8% more body damage and around 6%. I'm rounding a fair bit here just to get through this, just to show you what they look like. 6% more weak spot damage. Crit amplifier versus munitions. This is where it changes a little bit if you are using the crossbow to mark targets. So you still get around, it's around 2.5% more body shot damage if you use crit amplifier. And munitions actually overtakes it by 0.5% for weak spot damage. I'll just do a box around it to show you that munitions actually does more damage than crit amplifier when using the crossbow on a weak spot, only by like 0.5%. That's because weapon damage is stacking better with weak spot damage than crit damage stacks with weak spot damage, because they're additive and weapon is multiplicative with a weak spot. So that's how it overtakes it there. And then weak spot damage, plus 25%. So for the body, crit amplifier did 14% more damage and 1.3% more damage on the weak spot. So this is all with the crossbow. Now, if we don't use the crossbow and we use something like bingo or the wildfire to mark targets, crit amplifier gets even better. I don't really like using the crossbow. The crossbow is very specific for very specific bosses with weak spots. I prefer to, my preference is actually just to use bingo, switch to it, you mark it, and away you go. So if you use bingo instead, crit crit amplifier versus crit boost, the difference then jumps to around 6.7% on the body and 5.3%, let's say 5% on weak spots. For elemental overload, we have 12% and 7%. Okay, I think you're going to get the picture here, right? Like, crit amplifier does better once you drop crossbow, and when it gets to munitions, it overtakes munitions as well. Munitions is around 5% better on the body and around 2% better on weak spots. All right, so the golden rule is still aim for crit amplifier. It has the best damage whether you're using the crossbow or not. There are some close seconds, mainly crit boost and munitions amplifier. Okay, let's talk about the pants and which is the best mod for that. Deadshot says each crit hit by non-melee weapons grants 5% crit damage up to 45%. The effect is removed upon the next reload. So obviously really good for what we're running. Higher the crit rate, it means every shot's going to add a 5% onto the crit damage. Very nice. A bullet siphon says weapon damage plus 5% for every just a straight weapon damage plus 5%, and then every 5 bullets consumed in the magazine grants 4% weapon damage, capped at 20%. So for all of these calculations, I always do like the mod running at its best. So you know you got the 20% of the weapon damage plus the flat 5% there. Abnormal increase, which has actually recently had a name change to abnormal increase. I think before it was called, when I actually started this video, it was called status amplification. And that says when the magazine is empty, status damage plus 10% for 12 seconds. Effect can stack up to 3 times. So of course I did give it the 30% status damage. And then precision charge for every 10% weak spot hit rate of the previous magazine, elemental damage plus 4% up to 24%. So I just gave it elemental damage, 24%. Right. I'm going to run you through all of these. Right, so Deadshot outperformed everything. It did 13% more damage compared to Bullet Siphon on the body. It did around 11% more damage compared to Abnormal Increase on the body shots. And it did like 13% more damage against Precision Charge on body shots. When it came to weak spots, if you use Deadshot over everything else, did around, actually it was around 8 to 9% more damage on Bullet Siphon. It did around 8% more damage on Abnormal Increase, and did about 11% more damage on Precision Charge. It is easily the best mod you should have on your pants for damage. Okay, let's talk about top mods. Now, there's not too many options here if you just want to build purely into damage. You either got to go with the crit damage enhancements, which gives you plus 2% crit rate and crit damage plus 12%, or munitions amplifier, which gives you weapon damage plus 9%. For both of them, of course, you still want to be going for the violent mod, which is going to give you even more crit damage. Now for the calculation, I did punch both of these into an endgame build. So I had the weapon damage from the Cradle, and also like every other mod theoretically at like 15% crit damage for its main attribute. So lots of stat points into crit damage, lots of stat points into weapon damage to then compare both of these. Crit damage enhancement came out on top with body shots, approximately 2% more damage on body shots and 1.2% damage more on weak spots if you use crit enhancement over munitions amplifier. This is pretty close together, which is good to know because these can be an absolute pain to farm because they are blue. So you either need to waste controllers, just farm them in silos, which depending on how much you play the game, that's probably a waste of your controllers, or you need to randomly get them from gear crates. So have a look through your mods, see if you've got crit damage enhancement that's violent. And if you don't, have a look at munitions amplifier and see if you've got one of them that's violent, and pick the best one based on their secondary or primary secondary attributes. Let's talk about boot mods, and this is a really easy selection because covered advanced. We don't really have to do any of the maths for this because this is just straight up going to be better than anything else. You take no damage for 4 seconds. You get 20% weapon damage, which is going to boost all your bullets, right? Every crit's going to have a 20% on top of that. But you also get 20% status damage. That's going to boost your unstable bomber explosions. And this lasts for 30 seconds, which is a huge amount of time. I'm surprised, fingers crossed, this hasn't been nerfed yet because it's by far one of the best mods for your boots. There's nothing else that really comes close to this. I mean, unless you want to refill your magazine by killing 2 enemies, which is fine if you're just taking out, running silos and you want to have this on for the small enemies before you get to a boss. But everything else, like, slow and steady, you get 10% status damage and another 10% when you're above HPs above 90%. So that's only 20% status damage. You get 20% status damage from covered advance and 20% weapon damage. So yeah, that is your best one to run in your boot slot. Okay, let's talk about food buffs. Now, admittedly, this is probably the weakest portion of the video because I neglect food buffs. I haven't really put much effort into farming certain things, and you kind of need to do, so don't be like me. That being said, I did the math on it. Some of these recipes I think I was missing, so I did have to take this from a website. So hopefully these haven't changed percentage-wise. But we have the fried hot dog, which does 20% damage to enemies affected by bullseye. And obviously for this build, we are using bullseye. And this is 20% damage on your bullets and also on your status damage. So straight off the bat, you can predict that this is going to be better damage-wise. Shattered bread has weapon damage, 25%. The Stargazy pie has crit damage 20%. The bone-in deviated sausage has boss damage at 15%, and Stardust pumpkin has crit damage at 15%. And you also have the whimsical drink, which has 25% status in damage. So I compared fried hot dog versus everything else. It did more body shot damage and more weak spot damage than all the other things that you can craft. So if you want something to aim for, look at crafting fried hot dog with this specific build. And then also whimsical drink. Okay, let's have a look at your Cradle options. Starting at the top, handgun enhancement is going to give you weapon damage 20% when holding a pistol, so it's perfect for us. Master Tactician, after using a tactical item, damage against the Great Ones plus 25% for 15 seconds, that's good. Deviation Master, while Deviation is present, damage against Great Ones is plus 25%, so you want to have Deviation out when you're doing damage against bosses. Tactical combo, weapon damage plus 25% for 4 seconds after switching weapons or reloading. This is what I was saying before with our magazine capacity. You kind of want your magazine capacity to finish at around 4 seconds, so then you're getting the most out of tactical combo. Status enhancement, after hitting a weak spot, status damage plus 25% for 3 seconds. So once again, having that longer magazine capacity, you're not going to make as much use of status enhancement. And this is going to buff your unstable bomber explosions. You also have first round blast. After reloading, instant damage for unstable bomber plus 25% for 4 seconds. It's another short Cradle Override mod, so this is really good. Then steady hand, while in Fortress Warfare or Fast Gunner, weak spot damage plus 40%, weak spot damage to the bullseye plus 20%. So we're using bullseye, but you need to be in Fortress Warfare. So to do that, you do need to be running a long axe, right? You do a heavy swing on the long axe, and this is going to give you Fortress Warfare when you stand in it. And finally, heavy strike. This is specific to this hard server. Fortress Warfare range plus 50%. After activating Fortress Warfare weapon, damage plus 25% for 8 seconds. So really good. Once again, you've got to be using that axe to activate Fortress Warfare. Just a quick note on Fortress Warfare. You can activate the heavy swing and like animation cancel. I have my change weapons on my scroll wheel. So essentially I just go right click and then just spam the scroll wheel, and then you can hit for your marked targets, and then you can switch to your weapon for DPS. Okay, let's have a quick chat about deviations, because you want to pull out your deviation when you're doing DPS, because there is a Cradle Override perk that increases your damage when you're fighting alongside a deviation. I'll be honest, this is similar to the meal prep for me. I've been really lazy with getting my recipes, making sure I have all the ingredients for certain meals, and I've been really lazy with farming deviations. I pretty much got the lone wolf, like obviously like many people early on in the game, and just use that throughout because I just kind of enjoyed it. This is in Eternal Land, so my good one's actually on my actual server. But as your skill rating increases, so does your weapon damage. So on skill rating 1 for the wolf, you have 21.6% weapon damage on the attack target. The wolf also like multiplies as it destroys enemies as you go through like a silo. So if it takes out a small enemy, it multiplies. Pretty good for controlling ads. Now, what I really should be using, just stats-wise, is the Mini Feaster. This one I've got a skill rating of 3, and its weapon damage does 21% per tentacle. So these tentacles come out, they randomly target an enemy in front of you, and the more tentacles you get, the more damage it does, and you can go up to 84%. So there's a chance the tentacle won't go onto the boss that you're damaging if there are other enemies around, unless you're using bounce. We're obviously not using bounce, so that doesn't really matter. But if we can clear the map and only have a single enemy, which is the boss we want to do damage against, this is going to be very, very good for that. And that concludes my hour-and-a-half build video for Jaws, the ultimate guide. Hopefully you learned something. I doubt you watched all of it, and if you did, congratulations. Like I said, there was a sponsor at the beginning of this video. If you could leave a like or a comment. If you can't think of a comment, you can just leave the word Jaws. That would be really helpful. As long as the video gets some views, sponsors will be happy. I can get more sponsors. I don't have to worry about uploading dog water content every second day to try to appease the YouTube algorithm. I can just spend time making useful videos, and the sponsor pays for that. All right. Thanks for joining. Appreciate it. See you next time. Bye-bye.